Yeah, g'day YouTubers, it's Spanner Man again here with another video. Today I'm going to go over some hand filing and using electric grinders. This video is for the beginners, it's not for the professionals because they know what they're doing. So first of all, we've got a chain here and a little bit of a jig, but you can put your chainsaw bar in a vise. I always use brass little angles on there so that the vice grips don't damage the bar or take all the paint off, so that's up to you. But a little jig like this is about $40, so that works quite well. So probably one of the first things I want to talk about is if we go back in history before 1947, they used to have what they call scratcher chains on chainsaws, and those scratcher chains were virtually two teeth, one in front of each other with a slight angle on them, and they were virtually that invention was done hundreds of years ago. When they used to have saws, you probably used to see the old saws where you had a guy on each end, had a wooden handle on the end of the metal saw, and they would pull backwards and forwards cutting timber down. So that's how it was done. But there was a guy over in Portland, Oregon by the name of Joseph Cox that was a pro logger, and he didn't like the way that the chainsaw was cutting with the scratcher teeth, so he actually invented his own design, which was called the Cox chipper chain, which is virtually identical to what we've got today. Now, him and his wife started their own company called the Oregon Saw Chain Company. Later, Oregon Tool Company is what we know it today. So the modern chipper chain, we can be thankful for Joseph Cox for that, and he was only a logger, but he was a very intelligent man. Okay, so let's talk about teeth, geometry, very important. The basic tooth out there that we use today, this is a bit of a replica that I made up, is what we call a semi-chisel. Now, if you look at a semi-chisel, it's got a nice little radius on the top there, and if you look at the front of it, you can see that radius. Whereas if we look at a full chisel chain, so this is a full chisel chain, you'll notice that it's a very sharp point. There's very, very little radius. Now, the other thing to also notice about when we talk about chainsaw tooth, is what's very important, that this is replicating a full chisel tooth, which comes to a very sharp point. You can see that sharp point there. Now, that's the first part that bites into the timber, and that's the first part that will get blunt. Once that gets blunt, it doesn't cut timber very good, especially if it hits dirt. Whereas the semi-chisel, having that radius on there, is a little bit more forgiving if it hits dirt. So if you're cutting really clean timber, I use a full chisel all the time. If you're cutting timber that's on the ground, you probably want to use a semi-chisel, but for me, I generally use full chisels all the time. Now, the other thing is that when you use a file or whether you use a grinder, one of the things that you must try to maintain is keeping this nice little C shape, what they refer to, that's called the C shape, and don't grind a file below this line here. Now, the top of the tooth and the side of the tooth are flash chromed, so they're very, very hard, which extends the life of the cutting. Also, you'll notice that the tooth goes down on a backward slope. That's to reduce drag and friction as the chain passes through the timber. Also on the top, you'll notice that it's wider at the top here and narrow down the bottom. It's the same thing to reduce drag and friction. You'll also notice a mark on the side here. This mark is called the witness mark. By the time you grind down slowly or file down and reach this mark, it's the end of the life of the chain. The angle that you grind on is fairly important. It's set at 30 degrees for a steel chain, and it's set at 25 degrees, which is about something like that for Oregon, Charlton, and some of the other chains that are out there. So, milling chains, which is used for slabbing timber, are set roughly anywhere from 10 to 15 degrees. That's because they don't want the chain too aggressive and jumping around. One of the other things people can make mistakes is grinding their rakers down too much. If you grind the raker, we'll just zoom in there. So if you were to grind the raker down too much, the tooth bites in, bogs down, and the saws jumping all around the place. So you want to avoid that. So okay, let's get on to the filing part. Only one other thing that I might mention before we get onto the filing is I've got a duplicate of this tooth. Now, still have got a new chain out that they call a hexacut, which is a hexagonal shape here rather than that traditional C shape. I actually don't buy the Stihl hexa chain. I do them myself because if you hold it up like this, it's virtually a right angle. So what I do on my grinding wheel is dress the stone up, so rather than have a curve on the stone, it's a dead flat. And then coming in at a 60-degree angle, then I get this type of shape. So that's a little tip if you want to try out a hexacut or a V shape. You can call it V because it looks like a bit of a V that way. Dress your stone up dead flat and you'll find out that you can end up with a chain with that shape, and it probably cuts. Oh, look, I've been using it for a while, so yeah, I'm happy with it. Now, the other thing, if we talk about filing, we'll just sort of get onto the Raker gauges first. The Raker gauges need to be checked periodically, but if I've got about half a dozen chains in there, I'm never going to know which one was checked or when it was checked. So every time I sharpen a chain, out comes a Raker gauge, just have a bit of a quick check. This is a Raker gauge. Now, you can get this from your local Stihl dealer, or you can go to other dealers sell aftermarket ones. You'll see 30 degrees, 10 degrees, 35 degrees, and 0 degrees. And at the end, where the slot is here, this is where you check the Raker. You'll see 0.65. That represents a millimetre, so 0.65 of a millimetre. What that actually means is that the Raker should sit 0.65 of a millimetre from the highest part of the tooth. So it's just a matter of grabbing that Raker gauge, placing it over the tooth. It'll drop down. Now, if we zoom in there, you should be able, you'll see that Raker, you'll see it there. And you'll get a flat file. And if that was protruding, then you'll get your flat file and you'll just gently take 2-3 strokes, check it again, and check the next tooth, and you'll probably find that every single Raker will need to be adjusted. Now, how often is that done? Look, you don't need to do it a lot because you're talking about the tooth. If you start grinding the tooth down during its life, by the time you get right down to the back here, that Raker will probably lose about a millimetre. So the distance from a brand new chain from the front of the tooth down to the witness mark is probably about 8 millimetres. So it's about 8 to 1. So every time that you sharpen your chain about 8 times, you probably need to touch that once every 8 times. So you don't need to do it much, but it pays to check. Now, the only other thing I'll say about the Raker gauge, if you're cutting really soft timber, you can go down a little bit less than 0.65. You can go 0.75. So that's fairly standard common knowledge. But I'm only sort of telling the beginners what you should know. So go down, get yourself a Raker gauge from Stihl or Husqvarna or some other manufacturer and do that. Now, when we spoke about the 30 degrees, that 30 degrees that we're referring to is that top plate angle. That's that angle that you can see there. Now, Stihl is 30 degrees, and as I said, some of the other chains are 25 degrees. Now, if you've got an old second-hand chain, you go, well, you know, where's 25 degrees, where's 30 degrees? On a lot of the chains, they put a little mark on top, and that indicates where you're 30 degrees or you're 25 degrees. Alternatively, you can go out and buy yourself one of these little clamps that clamp onto a file. And you can see it's got 30 degrees here, left and right. It's got 25 degrees to the left, 25 degrees to the right, and 35 degrees here. So these are only about $6 or $7, and the whole idea is that you place the file underneath and you tighten the clamps off. And what you would do, when you place that on the tooth, the whole idea, if you look at the cross there, you'll see the 30 degrees. And those lines must line up in the direction of the chain. So that way you can't make a mistake. If you tilt it this way too much, you'll see that the line doesn't line up. If you tilt it that way too much, you'll see that the line doesn't line up. So that line that's at the top there, once that lines up in the direction of the chain, you're right. Now, a lot of people use these. I don't tend to use them because I've been sharpening chains for 20, 30 years, so you get pretty much used to it. So let's talk about filing. Okay, there's the smallest file that you can get that I know of is about a 3.2 millimeter file, which is for a very small Pico chain. And the largest file that you use is about 5.5 millimeter, which is used on a 0.404 chain or a 3/8 chain. A 4 millimeter file is used for a 3/8 low profile chain. So make sure you get yourself a good quality file, either a still file or the Velobe, which is Swiss. Don't buy real cheap Chinese files, they won't last as long. Somebody worked out that you could do about 5,000 files, strokes of the file, and it would be worn out. That's probably pretty accurate and close. There's 72 teeth on a 20-inch chain, so 36 on one side, 36 on the other. If you're doing about 7 or 8 strokes, I don't know, it's probably just under 500 strokes of the file, so go in by that sort of number. You're only going to get about 10, 12 filings, sharpening up a 20-inch chain, and then you'll need a new file. So nothing worse than trying to sharpen a chain with a blunt file. So if you go out and buy files and you're going to stick to file, and get yourself, they're cheaper by the dozen, so buy a pack of 12. The other thing is, never draw the file back, and always push the file from the inside of the tooth to the outside, never the other way around, because it won't sharpen very good. And always make sure that when you've pushed the file and you get to the end, that you lift the file out and pull it back, because don't draw the file back on the tooth, because it's going to damage the file in time. So that's the worst thing you can do to your file. The other thing is, make sure that you clean the teeth even with a little brush, or wash them in solvent, so that the file doesn't all fill up with oil and rubbish. Get yourself a file card or a little brush or something so that you can clean the file out, because there's nothing worse than a file that clogs up. So the correct way to hold a file, so if we zoom in there, we'll just see if we can zoom in and have a look at a tooth there. A file should fit in there relatively good, and it should stick slightly above the tooth, which you can see there, roughly about 20% higher. So please make sure that you're using the correct file. Don't use a file too small, or don't use a file too big. If you're unsure, just ring up your local chainsaw dealer, tell them what sort of chain you got. If you don't know, take the chain down there. They'll tell you what file you should be using, because maybe you've gone out and bought yourself an electric chainsaw or a petrol chainsaw, and you're only sort of using it every now and then to prune up trees or the little bit of firewood, and maybe you're a little bit unsure of what you need. But anyway, I've given you a little bit of information. If you're using a 3/8 low profile, it's a 4 millimeter file, or if you're using a 3/8 standard chain, it's a 5.2 or a 5.5. Still recommend 5.2. A lot of people use 5.5 millimeter on a 3/8 chain. I use a 5.5 millimeter file on a 3/8 chain. It really doesn't make a huge deal of difference. I just like the using the file, because it's a little bit stiffer, a little bit more rigid. I find using a 4 millimeter file, when you put the handle on the end, there's a little bit of a flex there, because it's very skinny. 4 millimeters tends to have a little bit of a wobble on it, so not really happy using real small files. Okay, the correct way to hold a file. Well, the correct way to hold a file is that the file must sit parallel at 30 degrees. So you want to, as we said before, you don't want it too much one way, you don't want it too much the other way. You need it at 30 degrees. Okay, then the technique that you must develop, you can be slightly down 10 degrees, and then you will grab it in one hand, you'll grab with the forefinger and thumb, and the other hand, and you'll push forwards. Take the file off. You'll do that about 3-4 times. It depends on how much the chain was blunt. Inspect, feel it. If you've got really good 20/20 vision, you should be able to see that edge is very, very sharp and feel it, because your fingers have got a lot of nerves in them and they'll pick that up. Then if that's okay, then just proceed to do all the other teeth on the other side. And then when that's done, then normally what you would do, you would take the chain off and just turn it around the other side. It depends whether you're left or right-handed. And then proceed in the other direction to do the other tooth and do the same thing. Now, the other thing that can happen in hand filing is one hand can be stronger than the other. So bear in mind that if you're left-handed, you might be filing one side of the tooth more than the other side. So if you're stronger in one hand than the other, you might find that you've got uneven teeth. It doesn't matter if they're out a little bit, but during the life of the tooth, if you get down to halfway, you might find out that you could be 2 millimeters shorter than one side. If your tooth is 2 millimeters shorter than one side, you'll find out that the saw will cut crooked. So just bear in mind, you can use a shifting spanner, a small shifting spanner, and open it and use it as a gauge. That's a very cheap way of doing it. Or if you've got a digital vernier caliper, or a vernier caliper, even a plastic one, or something to measure the length of the teeth. Okay, so we'll take the teeth off. We'll talk about electric grinders. Now, in the background, you'll see this little blue grinder. I've had this for about 15 years. If you're going to get an electric grinder, it depends on how much money you want to spend. This is pretty much, you'll see these all over the world. They're made in China these days. Very, very basic. You don't have many adjustments on it. Well, you've really only got one, which is at the front here. You can select your degrees. So we start at 35 degrees, come back to 0, 35 degrees that side. So this is the adjustment. So if you've got a 30-degree chain, you'll put it on 30 degrees, put your chain in there. The only other adjustment that you can do is this adjustment here just moves the tooth in the right position so that the grinding wheel just comes in contact with it. And on top of, you've got a, well, here, I'll just see if I can get a picture of it. Oh. On top here, there is an adjustment here. This is the depth. Now, where do you set that on a chain? Normally you would set that, if you look at a tooth, remember before we spoke about being chrome plated on the top and being chrome plated on the side. So you never usually grind below the chrome plating. So if you've got a chain and you put the chain on there, you can just adjust that so it sits at the bottom of the tooth, and that should be a pretty good starting point. So that's that grinder. Now, the other one that we've got here is a bit more upmarket, and it's got a few more features on it than a standard grinder, and it costs about 3 times as much. So, but it's also based on a Oregon 510 or 520 or something like that anyway. So Oregon makes some beautiful electric grinders, very professional grinders. They use them in a lot of chainsaw shops. Now, again, same thing. You've got the 0 degrees, 35 degrees to the left, 35 degrees to the right. But if you loosen the locking nut underneath, the table will tilt this direction and tilt that direction. Now, a lot of chains have downward tilt. You can even file at a slight downward tilt, 10 degrees. Still recommend no tilt. Oregon, Charlton, Archer, ProCut, they all recommend 10-degree down tilt. Does it make much difference? Look, it makes a little bit of difference, but if you're chopping firewood or something like that, it's really not going to make any difference. Now, the other thing that you can do with this unit that you can't do with the blue unit is you'll see a little graduation here. This actual grinding head is set at 60 degrees, which is what most chains are made at manufacture. So you can tilt this up to 90 degrees, down to 40 degrees, but just stick to what the manufacturer recommend, which is 60 degrees. The other adjustment that you've got on here Let's just see if we can pull that around, is you've got this is exactly the same as the other one, where this controls this little bar here that sits behind the tooth, goes forwards or backwards, and brings the tooth to the grinding wheel. Now, we'll just set this chain up. A lot of people still make big mistakes in using electric grinders. They're too aggressive. They're using them like an angle grinder or a bench grinder, and they're not to be used that way, because if you use them too aggressive, now the other thing also, when you're using the grinder, make sure that you clean your chain, because if you don't clean your chain and all the dirt and gunk gets into the wheel, because the wheel's got little pores in it, they're only aluminium oxide wheels. You can see a little bit of black on here, but that's not too bad. Some of them really get that bad that they're really black, and if they're really black, they'll tend to overheat the chain. If you overheat the chain, or the tooth I should say, you'll find out that it can temper the steel and become very brittle. So to avoid that, when you bring the grinding wheel down, you bring it down very slowly and off, on, off, on. So first of all, we'll set up 30 degrees, because this is a brand new steel chain in here. I just thought I'd put a brand new chain for demonstration purposes rather than use an old second-hand chain. Now, there is another adjustment. You've got an adjustment wheel here, and this little unit moves to the back and to the front. So normally what you would do with this is set this in the middle of the tooth. So if you're working on the inside of the tooth, adjust this so the middle of this, I actually put a line on it. I'll just see if you can see that. If you look at that line that I've got there, I set that up so it sits right behind the tooth. So now, why is that important? On a brand new chain, it's not important, but as you wear down, if you actually have a good close look at that, you'll see that it comes to a little bit of an angle. There's a little bit of an angle at the edges, because when you get down to the witness mark, you'll end up grinding this if you don't push it over this side or you don't bring it over this side. So it depends whether you're working on the inside tooth or the outside tooth as to whether you push this in what direction. But bear in mind, on a new chain, it's not going to be an issue, but as the chain wears down, you'll have to start using this. So, okay, to set this up from scratch, put the chain in. I'll just adjust this. I get into the habit of doing it anyway, even though it really doesn't need it, but I do it anyway. I bring the wheel down, and I'll bring the camera in, so I want you to see this. Now, I can't bring it down because it's touching, the tooth is touching the grinding wheel too much. So I'll back this off. You can just see that, it's just touching. That's my starting point. Lock it up. Now, probably a little bit too much. So I'd rather go on the side of just touching. Yeah, it's a little bit too much still, so back that off, lock it back up. Yeah, that's better. Okay, that's what you want. You want it so that it's touching. Okay, if we lock this up now, start. Now, the other thing is, when I spoke to you earlier, I mentioned about using the file that, I don't know if I spoke to you or I mentioned it, but if you do roughly 10 strokes of the file, it takes approximately about 0.2 and 0.3 of a millimetre off the tooth. And that's all we want to take off about here, about 0.2, 0.3 of a mil, because if the chain hasn't hit any rocks and it's not damaged, all you're doing is slightly sharpening it up. So it needs very little metal off it. It's only if the tooth gets damaged that you might have to take a millimetre off. In that case, it's going to take a while to grind the tooth down. So we'll start the grinder. Now, you don't bring the grinding wheel down really hard. You bring it down nice and slow, gently touch, off and on. Now you can see I can touch that tooth. So, yeah, when you hear about people say, oh, you know, it turns the metal blue, well, obviously they've done it wrong. Inspect the tooth, have a look at it, because if it doesn't take enough metal off, you may have to give it a slight adjustment. But generally what I like to do is grind in one pass. So there's 36 teeth on this side, so it's just a matter of going to the next tooth, locking it back up, same procedure, off on. And same thing, I can touch that, not a problem. Then on to the next tooth. Same thing. So anyone that tells you that it overheats the tooth, it will overheat the tooth if you just bring it down and hold it. Like, if you do it like that, it's going to overheat the tooth. I didn't do it long enough, but if that's held down for about 10-15 seconds, just grinding away, that tooth will turn blue, and that's the incorrect way to do it. So then it's just a matter of doing all those teeth. Once that's all done, turn it to the other side, turn the grinder off. I'll adjust the wheel for the other side. And what we need to do now is exactly what we've done, is bring the wheel down. It's just touching the tooth. We'll just see if we can get a better video of that. A little bit tight in there. You can see that. It's just touching. So then go and grind. When you're finished, right, so after you've done all that and you've ground all the teeth, take your chain off and have a good look at the teeth. Make sure that it's ground properly. I think you can see that. Very, very sharp. Just try and find another one. That edge is very, very sharp. So the biggest mistake people make is, there's a few mistakes. If it's a steel chain that's 30 degrees, make sure that you grind the chain always at 30 degrees. If you keep swapping and changing between 25 and 30, what that will mean that you'll have to grind off excess metal each time you swap and change between one profile and the other profile, or between 25 and 30 degrees. So if you know that a steel chain is 30 degrees, which it is, yes, you can grind it at 25 degrees. If you do grind it at 25 degrees, then make sure that you stick to 25 degrees, because otherwise you're going to be grinding unnecessary metal off to get that profile back. Same thing as the 60 degrees. At the top, if 60 degrees is a standard recommendation, stick with the 60 degrees if you get one of these grinders. If you got one of the cheap ones that I showed you before, you don't have that adjustment. Don't try and set this up so that it takes off a millimeter, because if you try and do that, you'll turn the tooth blue, and it's just not the way it's done. It's like if someone's using a bench grinder, an angle grinder, and you're going to sharpen up a screwdriver, or you're going to sharpen up a chisel or something. You've got to do it very slow. So anytime that you grind any metal, especially if it's made out of some type of high impact, high carbon steel, do not grind so that you turn it blue. Some people even do it so it almost turns red hot. This is totally incorrect way of grinding. So grinding any metal, irrespective of whether it's a chainsaw grinder, or a bench grinder, or an angle grinder, the slower you do it, the better the job that will be done. So the biggest advice is take your time. It does not matter if it's going to take 10 or 15 minutes, even if you're using a file. Look, a 20-inch chain, if it just needs a couple of strokes, it's only going to take about 5 minutes. So it's probably not worth getting the angle grinder out and setting it all up for one chain. So that's when I'll use the file. But if I've got a dozen chains, then I'm going to use this. So what I will do is I'll do the dozen chains on the left hand, or this is set on the right hand side. So I will do a dozen chains on the right hand side or the left hand side. It doesn't really matter. It depends how it was set up. So it was previously set up on the right side. I would do all the right side first on the dozen chains, swap back over to the left side, and do the dozen chains. Otherwise, I'd have a dozen chains and I'll be just swapping backwards and forwards. There's no need to do that. So you can grind them all on one side first, make sure they're okay. If they're okay, then go to the other side. Or alternatively, if you want to, you could do each chain left, right, then do the next chain left, right. That's entirely up to you. That's your personal way of doing something. But I just find that if I had a dozen chains and I have to set this up backwards and forwards, that means I'd be doing that 24 times. Whereas if I had a dozen chains and I'd done the left side first, done my dozen chains, set it up on the right side, that means I've changed it once, not changed it 24 times. So that's my logic there. Don't go back. But look, if I had 2-3 chains, I'd probably just go left, right, bang, that chain's done. Do the next one, left, right, bang, that's done. But if I had, like I say, a large amount of chains, that's the way that I normally do it. It works fine, but that's personally up to you. Look, I hope this video has helped because there's a lot of people out there that are not too familiar. They may have brought a chainsaw and not really familiar. I hope that I've gone over the main points, but I'll just recap very, very shortly. If you use an electric grinder, make sure that when you bring the grinding wheel down onto, that you set this up first so that the grinding wheel just touches the tooth. You can bring it in and make this adjustment so that the grinding wheel rocks and touches. After that's all set up and you've locked it up, as you bring this down, off, on, because if you hold it down into the tooth, you're going to burn the tooth, and that's not a good, you're going to change the temper of the steel. So you don't want to be doing that. So number one rule, do that and do it slowly. The slower you do it, the better the job will be. With the file, make sure that you need to be able to file in a straight line. Some people use files and they can't keep the file straight, and the tooth ends up with an arc in it. Looks like well, not as bad as a banana, but I think you get the idea. They can't file straight. That's because they're not practicing properly or watching what they're doing or not watching the front of their hand. So make sure that you hold your file straight, parallel to the tooth, which is either 35 degrees or 25 degrees standard, and never file up like that. You can have 10 degrees downward tilt. That's quite normal, and that's accepted with most filing. Push in a forward motion and make sure that you don't curve that way or curve that way. If you curve that way, you're going to take metal off the front of the tooth and nothing much off the back, or vice versa. If you file that way, you'll find out you'll file the back of the tooth and you won't file anything at the front, and you're not going to sharpen it. And also make sure that as you push the file through, that simultaneously, the whole idea that it removes metal from the top plate and the side plate simultaneously, and it usually only takes about 4 or 5 strokes of a file to clean up the cutting edge simultaneously so that it's sharp again. And that's all it normally takes. So practice makes perfect. The other thing is, if you don't get it right the first time, it really doesn't matter. Look, one way you can tell if your filing is really good, that if you've got a brand new chain like this, so a brand spanking new chain, you pop it on your chainsaw, you're going out, and it lasts for, say, an hour and a half, and then it's blunt and you've got to sharpen it. Okay, so you go out in the field and you've got a file. You file it up, you put it back on, it lasts for another 1.5 hours, exactly roughly the same time, because you're cutting the same sort of timber. Then you know you filed good. But if you didn't file properly and it only lasts for half the time, then you know that your filing skills aren't any good. Now, that also applies to the grinder. So if you've got a brand new chain and you brought it back home and you ground it on one of these units here, and the next time you went out and you said, oh, look, I roughly got about 2 tankfuls of fuel, and the chain was still cutting reasonably good, but I decided to change it, and you found out that it was 2 tankfuls of fuel on a brand new chain, and then after you use your electric grinder, you roughly got about 2 tankfuls, then you know that you're grinding okay. So just bear in mind that it's good if you've got a brand new chain, you can use that brand new chain the time as a comparison. If you're cutting the same timber, now if you're cutting green timber as opposed to dried timber is going to be much harder to cut, then you can't compare. So I'm only saying that if you've got a brand new chain, and you may even have a second-hand chain which is exactly the same. So let's say that you had a brand new chain and you had a second-hand chain, which was, just say they were both a steel chain, and you'd only use the second-hand chain 2-3 times. So they're pretty much the same length, the teeth. And you've ground up the brand new chain is already ground up, and the second-hand chain has been already ground up, and you go out in the field, there's a log on the ground, and you're cutting the same sort of timber, and you put the brand new chain on, and then it's time to change it because it's gone blunt, and you were sawing roughly for an hour, and you've put on the second-hand chain, and you roughly sawed for about another hour. Then you know that your filing or your grinding is spot on. So look, I hope those little tips help, because I really could have had some of those tips when I first started using a chainsaw, because there was many things that I did wrong, and I just thought, oh yeah, it's got a degrees roughly on it. If I sharpen this, I looked at the angle and I didn't know what it was, but I just adjusted this. I said, oh yeah, that looks like that the grinding wheel is parallel with the tooth. So, and the book sort of, the instruction manual said, oh yeah, roughly between, it's either going to be 25 or 30 standard chain. So, and that's all I ever bothered about. I never thought about anything else. I never thought about whether the grease got on the wheel and dirtied it, and I never thought about if I brought the grinding head down that it would burn the teeth, because I'd blued a lot of the metal. So I done a lot of incorrect things when I first started, and I know that a lot of beginners are going to do a lot of wrong things also. So look, I really hope that video helps you, because it's helped me over the years. I've learned a lot. So leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.